welcome back to Games as Lit 101's analysis of the Gears of War trilogy. This is the second in a series of 4 videos analyzing the Gears of War trilogy from a literary perspective, highlighting the storytelling and narrative themes of the series, as well as the myriad ways in which it fails to effectively communicate them. If you haven't already, I highly recommend starting with the first video in this series, as this one continues off of it. These first 3 videos exist to summarize the stories of each game and go over some of the basic themes we'll be talking about later, and then the 4th and final video in this series is going to be the full analysis of the Gears of War trilogy. It's my hope that the first 3 episodes in this series can not only exist as a reminder of the stories of these games, but also as a way to set the stage for future analysis. I mentioned in the previous video that Gears 2 is my favorite from a narrative perspective, because while it suffers from many of the same flaws as the others in the series, it does manage to deliver on a few plot points and at least begins exploring some of the series' main themes. Following in the tradition of the series, it had a trailer that could, for lack of a better word, be described as artsy.
I have a rendezvous with death. At some disputed barricade. It may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land and close my eyes and quench my breath. I have a rendezvous with death. And I to my pledged word am true. I shall not fail that rendezvous.
Yes, that's a Gears of War trailer quoting an Alan Seeger poem, Rendezvous with Death, about meeting death with willingness and maybe even anticipation. Now don't worry, true to form, Gears of War 2 will not parallel with this in any discernible way, and in fact, it probably could have been a far more sensible trailer for the 3rd game than the 2nd, but I digress. Point being, Gears of War still wants to be more than it appears to be. Unfortunately, it still isn't, but this particular game is about as close as it ever gets. I'm going to once again remind you that Gears of War is rated M for strong language and graphic violence, and while I generally try and keep Games as Lit 101 accessible to all ages, analyzing this series is going to require portraying some of those elements of the work, so just be aware of that. And for this particular game, I'm also going to throw out a trigger warning for some suicidal story elements. So, that said, let's take a look. A cutscene at the beginning sets up the backstory the first game neglected to mention, which really means the savvy player could honestly skip the entire first game and be absolutely no worse off for it in terms of their understanding of the story. I think the first game is worth playing for other reasons, but the point is that the beginning of Gears 2 sets up the overall story far better than the first one does, and since all you even need to know about the first game is we put a bomb in the Locust tunnels, which is also established in this opening, I have far more respect for this sequel right out of the gate. I will briefly note that the first game's composer, Kevin Ripel, unfortunately did not return for this sequel, for reasons that I, for some reason, have been completely unable to find out anything about. He was replaced by Steve Jablonsky, composer for such classics as Transformers and Desperate Housewives. I mentioned it briefly before, but the first game's soundtrack was surprisingly good, like really genuinely good. The main theme in particular is actually one of my favorite pieces of video game music, and Jablonsky's score for Gears 2 really doesn't measure up. It's not bad, and it's fitting for the more action-oriented, heroic charge feel the game is going for, but it's all quite generic and never gains even a little of the atmosphere of Ripel's score for the first game. I don't have time to do any kind of in-depth analysis, but I highly recommend listening to the first game's main theme, or a song like Jacinto Prison, then checking out basically any track from the Gears 2 soundtrack. I think the difference will be fairly evident. Anyway, humanity has basically only one city that's still completely safe from the Locust, Jacinto. Since it's nestled on the coast on top of some incredibly solid rock, the Locust can't emerge from under the city, so it's remained relatively untouched. But now it's the last major stronghold, and the Locust are attacking it in full force. It's here we meet Ben Carmine, a rookie who still doesn't seem to grasp the basics of, well, anything. He's completely adorkable, and gives a good excuse for what I think may be one of my favorite tutorials I've ever played. It's skippable, which is a good thing in and of itself, but I always play it anyway because it's very natural and has some excellent setup for future plot points. It uses the excuse of training Carmine to deliver a few basic pointers, but actually turns into something of a patrol to give you an excuse for learning how to throw grenades and revive allies, all while putting you in no actual combat and establishing the characters of Marcus, Dom, and Benjamin quite well through their dialogue. It's honestly quite an excellent start to the game. Also, Okay, I know I'm getting on a lot of little sidetracks here, but hey, it's way better than the meaningless plot points from Gears of War 1 that didn't give me anything to talk about. There is something from Gears of War 1 that I didn't mention in that video because it honestly just wasn't important to the plot of that game, but it becomes important now. Anthony Carmine. Anthony Carmine was one of Delta Squad in the first game, and he was the only one decked out in full gear, including the helmet. Unfortunately, he was killed by a sniper when his gun got jammed, and aside from a brief in-game mention a minute later,
Carmine, man.
That's all we hear of him. Now though, we're introduced to Ben, and some dialogue in the tutorial confirms that he's Anthony's brother.
Yo, you said your name is Carmine? You got a brother was a gear?
Yeah, all four of us. Well, 3 now. You know one of them?
I served with Anthony. He was a good soldier. My respects.
Thanks. Just good to know he died a hero's death.
Yeah, right.
This seems like a minor point, but it's actually one of the more interesting thematic elements of the series, and we'll be coming back to it later. Anyway, since this game is actually bothering to introduce new characters and set up conflict, we're also introduced to another character, Ty Caliso. He's a Pacific Islander. Well, I mean, Sarah has different geography, so technically he's from the South Islands, but it's clear what they're going for here. And he has a very spiritual concept of war that's never explained or expanded on in any level of real detail. He's an interesting concept for a character, especially amid all these meathead macho stereotypes, since he maintains the macho-ness but expresses it in a completely different way. But despite his differences, he's something of a stereotype himself, and basically every element of his character exists just to emphasize how impossibly awesome and invincible he is. To be fair, there is a bigger reason for that, but again, we'll get to that later. The Gears successfully drive the Locust back, and we finally get a scene that outright acknowledges Dom's search for Maria.
We don't have any info after that.
There's gotta be another lead or something, right?
I'm sorry, Dom. That's it. I'm sorry.
Damn it! Not again! I've lost her again! Ah! God damn it!
Seeing some genuine emotion from him is great too. You can really feel his frustration and desperation in this scene, which is not only good for the story, it's a complete turnaround from the absolute lack of emotional connection the first game boasted. Next, we get more exposition by way of a cliché speech. Basically, the Locust have somehow been creating sinkholes big enough to swallow entire cities at once, and these events have been happening ever closer to Jacinto. If this can actually take out Jacinto, humanity is basically screwed, so the COG has switched to an aggressive approach. Head into the Locust tunnels and take them out before Jacinto is lost. The horror elements of the first game are mostly gone in this one, replaced with a more epic and encouraging tone to fit with the assault on the Locust stronghold. This is pretty common in sequels to stories with horror elements, from Alien to the Terminator to the Mummy movies, and it works well enough here, even if it does remove some of the first game's personality. Thankfully, the game pulls off Epic well, partially due to some impressive technology Epic Games used to cram a ton of different things onto the screen at the same time. It's pretty normal now, but they pushed the 360 to the limit, trying to get as much happening on screen as humanly possible, and it pays off in making for some really epic vistas and exciting background events. The Gears work their way to a place where they can effectively drill into the Locust tunnels, along the way further emphasizing that Ty is completely unstoppable.
Marcus, is that Ty?
Yeah, told you he was tough to kill.
When they begin drilling, a crazy Locust with a dual-sided chainsaw staff, in case you forgot that this is still kind of a dumb action series at heart, attacks, and Ty holds him off while Marcus and Dom plunge into the earth. The Locust caverns are actually quite visually interesting, and it's nice to see this amount of color after the drab palette of the first game. They spend a good while meeting up with other Gears, and eventually run into Ben Carmine. It's worth noting that Marcus is kind of hard on the kid, but he's not nearly as rough or cynical as you might expect. The first game painted a picture of a gruff, no-nonsense soldier, and while I wouldn't call that characterization inaccurate, this game shows a bit more depth to him. He's very encouraging to Carmine, even if he is a bit tough on him, and he's constantly encouraging everyone whenever they express concern for Ty, since they haven't seen him since he was holding off that Locust above ground. Even though he's jaded, he's surprisingly kind and optimistic in this game, and though it's a small touch, I think it goes a long way toward making him a more likable character. They end up coming across Cole and Baird, the latter of whom is trapped in some kind of metal pod. Apparently, the Locust have started taking prisoners, something they never used to do, at least as far as they were aware, and keeping them in these tiny pods for torture? It's kind of unclear why they're taking prisoners and treating them so poorly, but it's definitely implied that one doesn't want to spend long in one of those things, especially since Baird is the only person we find alive inside one of them. At least, he is for a little while. You later open a few jail cells similar to those pods, and out of one of them, Ty comes stumbling. He looks horrible, but confident that he's just as invincible as ever, Marcus tosses him a shotgun and gets ready to go.
Cole, Baird, cover that door! Carmine, Dom, guard the rear! Ty! No!
This scene is genuinely shocking and surprising, and really it's probably one of the best scenes in the whole series. I mean, it's relatively small in terms of, the big picture of the overall story, but it says so much. Ty was built up as completely invincible before this, in basically every interaction you had with him. Cutscenes regarded him with gravity. Everyone talks about how impossible he is to kill, and we've even seen a few instances of things that should have killed him, but instead just seem to mildly annoy him. Even the death of his squad is just taken in stride.
Sorry about your squad. Everything happens for a reason.
Ty is completely unbreakable, both in body and in spirit. But whatever happened in that cell, it broke him so badly that when given the opportunity to escape and go on, he instead decided to end his own life. That speaks volumes about how horribly the Locusts treat their captives, information that's incredibly important for later events. This scene is disturbing in just the right way to foreshadow an important plot point for later, and it's nice to see Gears of War say so much with so little, rather than the other way around. It's also nice to once again see some genuine emotion from Marcus.
I can't believe they did that to Ty. He survives everything, doesn't he?
Let's just get the hell out of here.
A few more plot points are established, most notably the architecture in the Locust tunnels suggesting they've been there an exceptionally long time, until we finally find out what's been sinking all the cities.
The entire city has been sunk, right at your position.
Anya! It's a giant worm! They're sinking cities with a giant worm!
Alright, I'm actually gonna defend this a little bit, alright? We did actually see that there are smaller worms in the tunnels, and so, a big one makes a level of sense, and giant worms are hardly foreign to science fiction in the first place. I mean, Dune is an obvious and huge example of this. And aside from that, it is very clear that there's plenty of life on Serra, especially underground, that the humans of the planet aren't familiar with yet. So I don't think the idea is too far-fetched that there could be a giant worm on the planet and the Locust could be directing him towards cities for the sake of weakening their foundations and making it easier for sinkholes to form there. That said,
It's a giant worm! They're sinking cities with a giant worm!
I feel like this is kind of like some of Destiny's dialogue, where it makes plenty of sense in context, but it still can sometimes sound kind of strange and juvenile because, I mean, it kind of is. That said, it does make plenty of sense in both contexts, in both games, so I'm not going to give this too much crap for it. Unfortunately, as our heroes are being extracted, the worm shows up and eats them all. And they survive. This might be the moment where the series jumps the shark for believability, but it's also over the top anyway. I feel like that's not really important at this point. Anyway, they're separated from Ben, and when they find him, he's being attacked by strange parasitic-looking little things that spring up inside of the worm. And unfortunately, they get to him far too late.
Sarge?
Carmine?
I hurt, Sarge. Tell my brothers and my mom. Tell them I love them. And
It's actually a fairly sad scene, as Ben was quite likable, even if he was a bit two-dimensional. Now's as good a time as any to talk about the role the Carmine brothers play in the Gears of War series as a whole. Both games thus far have featured one of the Carmine brothers, and in both cases they've ended up unfortunate casualties of war. One died unexpectedly, with no time to mourn him, the other died more slowly, surrounded by his friends. Neither were particularly well developed, but both of them were a palpable loss. Now, Carmine is a red-colored dye, and the word has also come to refer to just the color itself. It's a very deep red color, similar to the color of blood. Now, obviously, red has a number of symbols and meanings prescribed to it, but we're going to look specifically at what the color has come to mean in the context of science fiction. In the original Star Trek, crew members with red uniforms would often go on missions with the main characters. These characters would mostly be used to illustrate the danger of the situation by getting killed fairly early on, since a mission with no lethal consequence wouldn't be tense enough, but major characters couldn't just get killed off all over the place. Now, of course, this narrative device extends far beyond Star Trek, but that's what brought the concept into the popular consciousness and gave the trope its name. And indeed, red being the color of blood, it's a fitting color to associate with characters who only exist for the sake of being killed off. Awareness of this trope eventually meant that science fiction stories in general, and sometimes even genres outside of that, began subtly lampshading the concept and sometimes even outright parodying it. So Gears of War is telling us, through the symbolism of these characters' names, that they're essentially here to die. Now, it could be nothing more than lampshading a popular science fiction trope, but I think there's a little more to it than that, and we'll get into all the reasons why and what it means in the final analysis when we can take into account the events of the third game. So then, back to the story. Marcus decides to kill the worm rather than just escaping it, so they destroy its heart and cut their way out. But instead of being taken home, they're given a new mission based on a suspicious lead that implies the leadership of the Cog knows a bit more than anyone really knew. But in keeping with Gears of War tradition, this suspicion doesn't really get explained or go anywhere. This whole chapter of the game in the New Hope facility deals with some sort of secret experimentation involving the Locust, and while it is incredibly important to the overall story of Gears of War, at no point in this entire chapter or this entire trilogy of games is it actually explained. So we have this whole chapter where we go through this facility and we deal with this weird AI and a bunch of traps and some weird enemies that we don't see at any other point in the game. And ultimately, it's all just so we can find out where the Locust Stronghold is. So, since it bears absolutely no relevance to the trilogy as it presents the story, I'll talk more about it in the final analysis, but for now, all we need to know is that all of this big, padded, long level of the game led us to knowing where the Locust are. The whole thing feels like it's trying to return to the horror elements of the first game, but Gears 2 has so effectively moved on from that it just feels forced, and it's not nearly as effectively creepy as the first game occasionally got. I will give a brief shout out to the Razor Hail sequence, which gives a bit of insight into the crazy weather Sarah's been experiencing since this all went down, and provides a nice bit of tension similar to, if significantly less scary, than the Krill in the first game. It's a nice sequence, but doesn't make up for the entire level being a complete waste of time that breaks the narrative pacing of the game. But we head into the mountains and into a cave where some stranded are waiting. Apparently they've been hiding out here because the Locust have been taking people to what this guy calls the Nexus, and Dom manages to get some information about Maria. So Cole and Baird take the stranded to safety while Marcus and Dom descend into the Locust stronghold. Before getting into the Nexus, Dom recognizes something the old man said and pleads with Marcus to look for Maria before continuing into the stronghold. Marcus maintains that the mission is more important, but ultimately...
I'm sorry, Marcus. After what you did for your father, I thought you'd understand.
I like that bit of dialogue. I mean, it doesn't really tell us any specifics about Marcus's past, but when they hinted at it in the first game, all they told us about was an event of his trial. This actually tells us something of Marcus's own actions, something that he did. We can easily infer that he risked a mission in order to try and save his father sometime in the past, and you know, that tells us more about the character, and it gives him a good enough reason to help Dom out here. Eventually, they find Maria.
Maria. Maria. No, no, no. No, baby. No, 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 no. What did they do to you? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Maria. I tried to find you. God, I did. Please, no. Maria. God damn it, it's me, Dominic. It's Dominic. Marcus, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, man.
No. It's okay.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Maria. I love you so much.
This was the scene that surprised everyone. I mean, the simple presence of emotion was completely unprecedented in a Gears of War game, but beyond just being emotional, this scene actually brought many players to the point of tears. And indeed, it is a deftly executed scene, and by far the most effective dramatic moment in the series. Now, I'm going to acknowledge right here that the story almost literally stuffs Maria into a refrigerator for this bit, and I recognize that that is a problem on a cultural level, but separating this story from all the cultural context of that trope, with its overuse and abuse in various stories throughout the years, and just looking specifically at this story, I think it's all done rather well. It's worth noting that Ty was also sacrificed to this narrative, even if he had a level of agency in his death that Maria didn't, and as I mentioned before, breaking the most unbreakable character in the game to the point of taking his own life was a shocking and excellent way to establish the fact that death is a mercy for Maria after being in Locust captivity, and making Dom face this fact and do it himself is a very intimate and heartbreaking way for her death to happen. It's here that the gruff, stereotypical, hardcore Marine thing actually works in the game's favor, because seeing Dom completely break down like this is so much more affecting when he usually maintains such a tough guy composure. But the touch of having him see what he wanted to see her as she was, still alive and vibrant and beautiful, is probably the thing that elevates this scene from sad to downright heartbreaking. It's just an excellent and effectively emotional scene that stands out all the more for being surrounded by such mindless violence. It really is just a beautiful scene, and I'm not entirely sure it should have happened. Or at least when it did, or maybe the way it did. Okay, let me explain. Dom is by far the most interesting character in the series, and this is mostly due to the simple fact that he's basically the only character with an explicitly emotional connection to another human being. There's a bit of a bromance thing going on with Dom and Marcus, but even that is barely touched on until around this point in the story. Of all the characters, Dom is by far the most human, and this is mostly due to this subplot. And once Maria is dead, it's basically over. It just makes him really mad and gives him a beard in Gears of War 3. This certainly does play into some choices in the third game, and specifically into a really good scene we'll get to when we get to, but I can't help but feel that Maria's death was kind of a narrative cop-out. Like, there was a lot more potential in this subplot and in exploring Maria and Dom's relationship, but they avoided it because killing someone to motivate a main character is easier than introducing a new character and dealing with the scenarios that entails. I love this scene, and I love the foreshadowing, and I love the emotion they brought into it. I just feel like in the bigger picture of the Gears of War narrative, it may have been the wrong move. But it happened, and they did present it incredibly well, so that's enough of that. As you can imagine, Dom is itching to kill some Locust. They get to a safe point where other gears can drill down and discover the source of a voice we've heard off and on throughout the series, the Locust Queen. She sounds demanding, authoritative, and
The great flood shall vanquish all our enemies. Let it flow!
and sexy? I really hope it doesn't go that route. Well, down there, they come across voice records for Marcus's father, Adam Phoenix. Finally, we're getting back to how weird it was for Marcus's dad to have information on the Locust, which gives no detail as to what his connection to the Locust actually is. The recording explains that sinking Jacinto would, due to its position on the coast, flood the Locust tunnels with seawater. The Locusts themselves are planning on sinking the city, of course, but only after much preparation, excavation, and evacuation to minimize the damage to themselves. Which means that if our heroes can't kill the Queen down here, their best option would be to sacrifice the last major human refuge for the sake of dumping the ocean into the Locust tunnels. This is actually a really interesting plot point, as it changes the goal from killing the bad guy to racing them toward a common goal that will badly cripple both sides, raising the stakes significantly for a desperate and intense final chapter. And now we get to meet the Locust Queen. Sci-fi has some awesome alien queens, like, well, you know, the alien queen from Aliens, so I can't wait to see this one. Seriously? We're going with the old, all these aliens are ugly and horrible, but their queen is some sort of sexy human chick for no reason approach? Really, I am sitting here trying to prove that Gears of War has more to it than its stupid dude bro reputation, and you give me a sexy human alien queen that makes no sense? Are you trying to prove me wrong? But okay, let's just calm down and think about this for a second. I mean, maybe there is an explanation. Maybe the Locusts are connected to humans somehow, like they're related to them or created by them, and the Locust Queen is more human or something. I mean, really, I'm sure that there's going to be a twist in the story down the line or something, right? That explains this and gives us the origins. Of course not. Let's just get on with it. She gloats and talks a bit about Marcus's dad so as to further arouse suspicion without actually explaining anything. Well, at least they're talking about it now. Then leaves that crazy Locust thing behind to fight them. In the end, they escape and get to Jacinto, and after a few crazy events, they manage to sink the city and escape with everyone intact. Oh, and we get some hinting at some kind of close relationship between Marcus and Anya, despite such a thing never even being hinted at before. The Queen has a voiceover saying all the typical stuff about how they're not defeated yet, and we end with a cryptic radio message from Adam Phoenix.
Can you hear me? What have you done?
Now, if you've played the game, you might have noticed that I left out kind of an important plot point. If you haven't played the game, you probably didn't notice this, because it has absolutely no bearing on the story until the next game, and for that matter is one of the more poorly presented plot twists I've seen in a while. There's a growing number of glowing locusts that are considered lambent, having come into direct contact with emulsion, and they're waging a war against the normal locust. It would remind me of the reveal of the Flood in Halo, except that the Flood actually, mattered. The concept of lambent locust was revealed in the first game, but just as a unique curiosity, so the reveal that they're growing and fighting against the locust should be a pretty interesting reveal, but its complete lack of significance to the story of this game makes it one of the more lazily executed "a new challenger arrives" twists I've ever seen. Which is a shame, because, as I said, Gears of War 2 has some great ideas and some equally great moments. It develops its characters better than the first one, it sets up its plot better than the first one, the story follows more smoothly than the first one, it's just better in nearly every way. The only thing I think works less than the first game is the music, but while it is unfortunate, I can forgive it pretty easily. All these improvements, along with some genuinely good scenes and narrative setups, make me want to give Gears 2 a pass, but I'm honestly kind of conflicted on it. I mean, one of the major things I've been praising the game for is basically just competent storytelling, and I feel like we should be holding our games to a higher standard than that. I enjoy it in the same way as I enjoy a mindless action flick, and it has just enough interesting narrative decisions and excellent scenes to make me feel like I want it to be more than that, but while this is definitely the series' most valiant effort, Looking at it as a whole, I can't say it fully succeeds. As I've said before, I think it's absolutely ridiculous to believe that an action-packed power fantasy of a story still can't have some level of deeper meaning, and I can see where Gears of War 2 tries to accomplish this, but as with the series as a whole, it's very clear that that power fantasy was a much higher priority than the effective communication of that meaning, and the story suffers as a result. The nice thing is that Gears 2 comes far closer than its predecessor, largely because the game's flaws, by and large, are flaws of structure, pacing, and pandering to its target audience, as opposed to, the meaning and narrative flaws of the first game. Whereas the first game suffered from having no meaning, stemming from having almost no story, Gears 2 does have meaning. I mean, it does get kind of buried under buckets of testosterone, huge muscles, giant worms, and chainsaw guns, but it is still there. As I explained at the beginning of this video, its purpose is to summarize the events of the second game and lay some groundwork for future analysis. So that's all for now. In a few days I'll put up a similar video for the third game, and a few days after that I'll put up the fourth and final video in this series in order to give the whole Gears of War series some proper analysis. So go ahead and have at it in the comments, and we'll take a look at Gears of War 3 in a few days to see how it tries to tie all this stuff together and it kind of falls apart in the process. So don't forget to check out Games as Literature on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. All those links are in the description. And until next time, class dismissed.
Try to keep a blank page, but these memories, they flood my mind with grief. Faces lost forever, and the guilt of feeling some kind of relief. But when the end finally comes, I won't despair. I'll just keep on hoping I might see you there.
No!
I'm kidding. She wants to be in your lap.
I think she does. Hi, I appreciate that, and in any other context I would be super happy. But I got some video to film.